We are in Job chapter 19, verses 25 through 27. And I know Job, if you're familiar with it, is not the kind of part of the Bible that you associate with Christmas, but I will get there, trust me, and you'll see. We're going to start in Belfast, North Ireland. A long, long time ago, a boy was born there. His family called him Jack, and Jack was born into a good Christian family. But when he was 9, his mom passed away. I know that when I was that age, something happened to my mom was my worst fear. And sure enough, it changed Jack's life for the worse for many, many years. His dad was so covered in grief that he couldn't understand how he could possibly raise Jack and his younger brother. And so he sent them off to a boarding school in England. And that boarding school, and you hear English people talk about boarding school stories, and they can vary from very, very good to very, very bad. Jack's was bad. The headmaster of that school was actually later found to be insane. So he was a very disturbed man, and so that was a very dark time for this little boy as he grew up. By the time he was 18 and graduated from that place, he had completely abandoned the faith that he had been taught as a boy. He just couldn't understand how there could possibly be a good God, a gracious God in charge of the universe with all the things that happened. And then he graduated just in time to serve in the British Expeditionary Forces in World War I. And I don't know how much you know about that conflict since it's over 100 years old, but for my money, it's the worst war that's ever been fought. So bloody and traumatic, so much needless slaughter. And Jack was right on the front lines of all of it in Europe, saw the worst of what humanity can do to itself. And so his lack of faith was absolutely cemented by that time. Now, Jack was a brilliant young man intellectually, and he was able to get a career in academia. He actually became a professor of ancient literature at Oxford University. If you know anything about Oxford, you know that's no small achievement. He loved old stories, which is why he taught that subject. He loved the way in old stories there was a clear-cut good guy and bad guy, and how heroes always won, and how life always triumphed over death. He didn't think any of that was true, of course. That's why it was so appealing in fiction form. But he was convinced the world itself was random and cruel and merciless, and anybody who thought different was just fooling themselves. But over time, he got to be friends with some of his fellow professors, also literature teachers. There was a guy named Hugh Dice, who was a devout Christian, who became his friend. Another devout Roman Catholic, a guy you may be familiar with named J.R.R. Tolkien, the guy who ended up writing the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And it bothered Jack that these people could have such faith that there is a good God and that Jesus is Savior of the world with all of the things that they could see. And how could they be so brilliant and believe something that he knew was not true? He was also reading some authors that were strong Christians, men like G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald. And again, it bothered him. How could people so brilliant believe things that I don't believe? One day he was out for a walk with his friends, and Tolkien and he were talking, and he said, you know, I love the stories we get to teach, but I wish they were true. I wish we could live in a world like the world in those stories. And Tolkien said an interesting thing. He says, you know, I think they are. He said, I think that's the reason why there are those kinds of stories all through history, from the myths in the ancient world to the fairy tales of the Middle Ages to superhero stories today. The reason these same themes keep coming up and up and up again is because deep down inside we know in our hearts that there is a great hero who can redeem us. And there will be a time when good will overcome evil and love will conquer death. And Lewis and Jack thought to himself, well, I wish that were true, but I know that it can't possibly be. Now, a lot of people today are like Jack, and they think about what we do here, singing our songs and praying our prayers to someone we can't see, and they say, well, that's foolishness. You're basically wishing upon a magical sky fairy. There's really no hope beyond what you can do and execute it with your own hands. And maybe even though you're here today, maybe you feel that way too. And I'm not going to ask anybody to identify themselves, of course, but the fact is there are a lot of folks, in fact, most Christians at some point go through a time of doubt, and maybe you're not even a believer yet. And if you think this world is nothing but darkness and there's no hope, that's what this series is about. It's about the hope that we can have and the way that hope pays off. We've been in a time machine, as it were. We've been looking at what it was like for the people who lived in those years before Jesus came, before that first Christmas, and what they put their hope in 2 weeks ago, we looked at how they hoped that there would be someone they called the branch, as if the nation of Israel, their people, had become a dead tree, but there would be a branch that would come forth and bring new life. And last week, we looked at that term Messiah, the anointed one. So both a king who would rescue us and a priest who would make us right with God. Today, we're going to look at a third term through the story of this guy named Job. And you want to talk about someone who experienced real darkness. Job was a man who everyone acknowledged was righteous. You know, there are those people in this world that do really well and they're successful, and you think, well, they don't deserve that. But everybody looked at Job and said, he deserves it. He's a truly good man in every way. And yet, in spite of his righteousness, in a single day, all of his wealth was gone and his children died. And shortly thereafter, his health began to spiral downward. And so we see Job by chapter 3 sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping himself with a broken piece of pottery because his skin was covered in itchy boils. And he's crying out to God, and he's just saying, Lord, where are you? I've served you all these years. I've tried to be faithful, but this is the result. Why don't you come and tell me why this is happening? And meanwhile, his friends sit around him and they go, shh, don't say these kinds of things. You can't talk that way. You can't ask such questions. I mean, if God's allowing this, it must be because you've done something wrong. So go ahead and admit what you've done wrong because you clearly deserve this. And Job knows that's not true. He's just crying out to God. And yet in the midst of his sorrow, in the midst of his pain, he still has hope. You know, one of the themes of Job is God's not offended when we're upset, when we're confused, when we're afraid, when we're angry. He just wants us to keep talking to him. He just wants us to keep coming to him. And there comes this point where Job expresses his faith in this way. In Job 19, 25 through 27, he says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold and not another. My heart faints within me." And most Bible scholars think that Job is the second oldest story in the Bible after only the creation story. They think Job lived years before Moses ever wrote down the first 5 books of the Bible. So Job didn't have scripture to look at. And yet he believed 2 things that are clearly scriptural, that the Bible would come along later and corroborate. First of all, he believed there's life after death. And that wasn't common in that world. He believed, he said, my skin will be destroyed, but in my flesh I will see God. But the second thing is what I want to talk to you about this morning. Job believed there was a Redeemer that would come and rescue him, that would set things right, that would answer his questions, that would make things the way they should be. And that term Redeemer is an interesting one because in Job's world it had 2 meanings, neither of which were religious. And I want to tell you about those real quickly. So first of all, in that world, there were no police. Society hadn't advanced to that level. So if you suffered a crime, let's say your cousin or your brother or sister or even your spouse or your child was assaulted in some way or even murdered, you couldn't go to the cops and you couldn't call some outside agency to take your place. So you and your family would gather together and you would elect among yourselves or among your tribe a redeemer or an avenger of blood. The Redeemer would go out and would get justice. They would catch the person who did this to your loved one, and they would bring them to justice. This is what, in fact, in the law of Moses in the Old Testament, you've heard that term, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Even if you've never read the Bible, you've heard that, right? And we think that's God laying down the law, that people who do wrong need to be punished. What that actually is God limiting justice. That's God saying to the Redeemer. So again, let's say you and I are part of a family and somebody we love gets beaten up. And it's saying to me, if y'all elect me as the Redeemer, you can go beat that other person up, but you can't kill them. Okay? If your friend, if your loved one has a black eye, you can't break their legs. If someone in your family got murdered, you can't slaughter their whole village. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Limit your justice. So that's the first meaning of the term Redeemer. It's someone who gets justice. It's someone who punishes evil and sets things right. The second way that term was used back then was as someone who brought mercy to people who were in trouble. So justice and mercy. Let me give you some examples. So in that world, most people were farmers. They made their living off the land. If you had a bad harvest, you couldn't feed your family. Someone would come in and say, okay, I'll feed you, but your land is mine now. Okay? You do that to survive. But now you've got no land. You've got no way to provide for yourself. A redeemer is someone who loved you enough and had enough resources to come along, buy the land from that person who took it, and give it back to you. Or if you were in such profound debt, such high debt against someone, you were sold into slavery, which was common in that world. If you couldn't pay your debts, you didn't declare bankruptcy. You went into slavery. But a redeemer could come along and pay the price to set you free. Now, that price had a very specific name. It was called a ransom. The ransom that was paid to redeem you from slavery, from landlessness, from unemployment. There's another example of this merciful kind of redeemer, and that is very specific. Ladies, you're not going to like this, but in that world, if your husband died and you didn't have sons, you were pretty much economically without a way to make a living. You had no recourse. You couldn't go out and get a job. You couldn't sell stuff because you probably didn't have anything to sell. So the redeemer would be someone in your family. Your husband's brother, your husband's cousin, or someone like that who would come along and say, I'm going to marry you so that you'll have someone to provide for you. And then you and I together will have sons, and God will give us sons so that when you're old, if I die before you, when you're old, those sons can provide for you. So you'll always be taken care of. That was what a redeemer did. And that's what we see in the book of Ruth. I don't know if you've ever read Ruth. If you've never read it, it'll take you about 5 minutes. It's a beautiful, heartwarming story. It's kind of a love story about this young woman named Ruth from Moab, not an Israelite, but her mother-in-law is, and together the two of them come back to Bethlehem where the mother-in-law is from. Ruth becomes a believer in the God of Israel. She's doing her best to provide for her mother-in-law, and along comes this relative of her dead husband named Boaz, and Boaz takes Ruth as his wife and cares for her and her mother-in-law, and God provides them with a son, and then that son grows up and has a son of his own, and then that son grows up and has a son of his own, and that son's name is David. And see, I just ruined the story for you. But still read it. It's an awesome story. So that's what a redeemer was. It was someone who brought justice, who punished evil, or it was someone who brought mercy, who rescued those who were suffering and couldn't take care of themselves. Now, the prophets come along much later. And after Job has already given this term redeemer a religious sense, this idea that there would be a future redeemer, they latch onto that and they say, that's exactly right. And I'm going to give you a couple of the prophecies from the Old Testament just so you see what I'm talking about. Jeremiah 50, verse 33 through 34. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the people of Israel are oppressed, and the people of Judah with them. All who took them captive have held them fast. They refuse to let them go. What is he talking about? In Job's own lifetime, the nation of Babylon came down and invaded Israel, destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burned the temple to the ground, killed thousands, and took the rest into captivity. Now, in that world, that happened all the time. Big countries were always swallowing up little countries, and the little country never, ever came back. They always just kind of melted into the big country, and that was the end of those people. This is why you don't meet any Philistines or Moabites or Edomites today or any of those other ites that are in the Bible. See, they all were conquered by other nations, and yet God goes on to say in Jeremiah, he will surely plead their cause. I'm sorry, their Redeemer is strong. The Lord of hosts is his name. He will surely plead their cause that he may give rest to the earth, but unrest to the inhabitants of Babylon. And so what Jeremiah is promising is, first of all, that Israel will get to come home and build a land again, and that happened. But he's also saying there's a greater Redeemer out there. The Redeemer who comes and punishes evil and puts things right. Just like God ended up punishing Babylon. There's no Babylon today, is there? Yeah. God made them pay for what they did to his people. In the same way, God takes the side of his people when they're hurting, when they're victims of injustice. This is why God can say, vengeance is mine. This is why God can say, love your enemies and pray for those who hate you. Because he knows vengeance is his job and he'll get it. He is the Redeemer. But then also there's Psalm 103, verse 2 and 4. The psalmist writes, bless the Lord, O my soul, who redeems your life from the pit. You ever feel like you've fallen into a hole and you can't get out? Have you ever felt like your life is just, through no fault of your own? Maybe you took a sudden health downturn. Maybe your work fired you or let you off and you didn't do anything wrong. Maybe you suffered an incredible betrayal on a relational sense. But all of a sudden your life is just in this dark place and you can't get out of it. But the psalmist says we have a Redeemer who comes and meets us in the fire. In the fiery furnace. He meets us in the pit and he brings us out and he sets us on our feet again. He has mercy on us. Our Redeemer, when he comes, he will have justice and he will have mercy, and we can count on that. So we know that Jesus is the Redeemer. That's not a surprise. What is a surprise is when the people saw him, saw the way he spoke and the things he did, they didn't understand. And first of the next year, the first series I'm planning to preach, Lord willing, is a whole series about how Jesus, nobody could figure him out in his lifetime, how he defied their expectations. And they were constantly saying, who is this guy? And the reason for that is because on the one hand, he did things that they expected a son of God to do. He walked on water. He stilled the storms. He healed people who'd been crippled or ill for their whole lives. He cast out demons. He raised the dead, for goodness sakes. And yet at the same time, they were expecting a political leader. They were expecting someone like King David who would come and defeat all their enemies, make them the kings of the Mediterranean, if not more. And Jesus showed no interest in combat. He showed no interest in political power. He in fact, when they would complain about the Romans, he'd say, hey, I know you don't like them, but love your enemies. Pray for those who hate you. They come to you and tell you to pick up that load and carry it a mile. You carry it 2 miles. So they couldn't understand, who is this guy? Even his closest friends were confused. There would be times when the disciples thought that Jesus wasn't listening. And they would get together and they would have these little arguments where they'd say, okay, we all know he's going to claim the throne in Jerusalem sooner or later. And when he does, everybody's going to bow down to him. And on that day, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be his right-hand man, right? Don't we all agree that I deserve to be his right? No. I think I should be the one. I'm more faithful than you. Oh, really? Well, that's not what my mom says. My mom says that I should be. Well, who cares about your mom? I think I should be. And Jesus is like, I'm listening to this. I hear what you're saying. And none of you have it. None of you understand, because the more ambition you have for your own advancement, the less you're going to advance in my kingdom. And the more it's about you serving others and putting others ahead of yourself, the more you will become great in my kingdom. And then he said this in Matthew 20:28, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. There's that word. That Redeemer word. He's going to pay the ransom. But he didn't say that, though, did he? He didn't say, I'm going to come and pay a ransom for the world. He said, I'm going to be a ransom. And they couldn't figure out what that meant. And when they thought about it too long, it scared them. And sometimes it even made them angry. Like this one time when Jesus was talking about, pretty soon I'm going to be arrested and they're going to put me to death. And Peter stands up and he says, no way, Lord, I'm not going to let it happen. And you know what Jesus said to him in that moment? Get behind me, Satan. Because if that's your attitude, you are the devil right now. You are standing between me and the mission that I came to earth to do, which is redeeming people. You can't go with me unless you're willing for me to redeem you and everybody else who needs redemption. And I think part of the problem for the disciples was they just couldn't imagine that God in heaven could love them that much. After what they had done and all the ways they'd failed and all the failures they knew they were capable of in the future, how could God pay such a ransom for me? And I want to ask you today, is Jesus your Redeemer? I don't just mean, have you prayed a prayer, been baptized, joined a church, maybe this one, maybe another one. Those are all good things. But has he redeemed your soul? Has he rescued you? Has he set you on your feet again? Has he begun that process of purging the evil from you so you can become more and more like him every single day? The great adventure, the great journey of life. If you're in darkness right now, the thing is, you go to the world and you say, hey, my life is terrible. And they say, yeah, that's life. That's the world we live in. So, might as well look out for yourself. Might as well have as much fun as you can while you can, because the end's coming. And the one who dies with the most toys wins. If you're in darkness, your sin nature says, this is probably because you deserve this. If there's a God, he doesn't care about you. How could he after the things you've done and the things you're probably going to do? But Jesus says, no, none of that's true. I'm the Redeemer. I came and I paid the highest possible cost. And that's what you mean. I am your Redeemer. I will defeat evil. I will rescue you. This time of year, we also sing, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lowly exile. Remembering how the people back then hoped in God, and he came through for them. And Jesus will come through for you. He didn't have to show up at the cross, but he did. He didn't even have to be born, but he was. When I started telling the story of young Jack, the little Irish boy who became an Oxford professor, who turned away from Christ but had these Christian friends who influenced him, you probably knew that I was talking about C.S. Lewis. Lewis, his testimony is that one day, after all these conversations, one day he went to the zoo with his friends, and on the way there, he wasn't a believer, but on the way home, he was. His most famous story, he's easily one of the top 5 most beloved Christian authors of our time. His most famous story, he tells about a little boy named Edmund who has an older brother and 2 sisters. He's very selfish. He's very jealous. He discovers this magical land named Narnia, created by and overseen by this wonderful lion named Aslan, who's strong and righteous. Edmund discovers Narnia and meets this evil witch and betrays his brother and his sisters to her in hopes that in that world he can be powerful. He can become a prince. But instead, the witch throws him in jail and gets ready to kill him as a traitor. But Aslan shows up, the king of the world shows up and says, I will trade places with this boy. If you kill me, you can set the boy free. And the witch is eager to take that deal because with Aslan out of the way, she'll rule everything. And so she puts him to death on the stone table. And then shortly thereafter, he comes back to life. And Edmund is so transformed by this act of unexpected grace that he becomes a new person. And at the end of the story, when there's a final battle between good and evil, he fights on the side of good. And in the future books, he's the most loyal of all to the side of good, because that's what happens when you see that kind of sacrifice. See, Jesus is our Redeemer. He did come into our lives to bring justice, to take away our sin, and to make us just like him. He did come into our hearts and have mercy on our souls and bring us out of the pit and give us brand new life. And if that happened to you, then that's the story you have. It's the greatest story ever told. And if it hasn't happened, then today can be the day. And Christmas 2024 can be the time you look back on and say, that's when my life really began.